So far in our sermon series, we've been discussing what it means to walk with Jesus. To walk with Jesus is to be transformed. It is to move another step closer to what God intended for us in the beginning. So far, we've talked about what it means to walk in forgiveness and to walk just a little bit further. And now we're going to talk about what it means to walk in expectation. To walk while expecting that Jesus is at work even in the midst of our suffering. I had my first personal encounter with suffering several years ago. I got off the bus on a chilly November day. I walked down the driveway, up the front porch stairs, and was greeted by my mother. And I could tell something was wrong. I could tell there was a different look in her eyes as she greeted me. And she sat me down on the couch, and she told me that my grandfather had just been diagnosed with lung cancer, and according to the doctors, only had a handful of months left to live. Now, if you've ever received news like this, you know that it is hard to process, and it is very easy to become fearful. What if this is our last Christmas with him? What if he isn't there to see me grow up and go to high school and graduate college? What if our precious moments together cease being moments and simply become memories? And as these fear-filled questions began to run through my mind, I saw my grandfather, and he had this faith and this expectation that Jesus was going to work in the midst of his suffering. And what I've learned from him and what I've learned from our text today is that faith surpasses fear. And so if you're following along today, you can turn to Mark chapter 5. That's where we'll be focusing. And this is still pretty early on in Jesus' ministry. And so far, he has called his disciples together. He has begun traveling and teaching to the crowds that followed him. He's also had some pretty miraculous healings. He's healed a paralytic, and he's healed a man with a withered hand, and he's saved a man who was possessed by a demon. And so at this point in time, Jesus is beginning to have quite a reputation as one who heals and saves and restores. And so this brings us to Mark chapter 5, verse 21, which says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live.' And so Jesus went with him." And so now we have this picture in which Jesus has just crossed over the sea on a boat. He stepped foot onto dry ground, and instantly a crowd surrounds him once again. But then suddenly, a man by the name of Jairus comes and bursts through the crowd and throws himself at Jesus' feet. Now, the text tells us that Jairus was a leader of the synagogue. So this means that he would have had the responsibility of preparing public worship gatherings. He would have appointed specific teachers and readers for their services. So that being said, Jairus would have had a pretty high standing within the Jewish community, and he no doubt would have heard about Jesus' miraculous healings. And so when he finds that his daughter is nearing the point of death, he searches for Jesus. And finding him in the midst of the crowd, he begins to push past the people. He is shoulder to shoulder with countless strangers, but he continues to move closer and closer, eyes fixed on Jesus. And with every step, he says to himself, "If he will just lay his hands on my daughter, she will be made well. If he will just lay his hands on my daughter, she will be made well." And then finally, seeing Jesus, with a faith surpassing fear, he casts aside his title as synagogue leader, and he throws himself at Jesus' feet, asking that he would just simply lay hands on his daughter so that she might be well again. We find here that faithful expectation leads to humility. And I remember seeing this played out in my grandfather's battle with cancer. When he started his treatments, he kind of had a different perspective on life. He began to take more time to just notice people, to learn names and to see faces. And, instead of being frustrated by the drivers who cut him off on the way to radiation therapy, he thought to himself, maybe they just got some bad news too. It completely changed his perspective on life. And although he had every worldly right to feel sorry for himself and to be angry, he remembered that this life is not about him, but about the kingdom of God being restored through Christ. And so he took his suffering as an opportunity to serve those around him and to love Jesus more. He was able to have a spirit of humility. And so as we walk in expectation, trusting in the healing power of Jesus, we too should be humble. We too should cast aside our titles. We too should throw ourselves at the feet of Jesus and with arms stretched out on a dusty road, ask that he would bring healing to a broken world. So in Jairus' story, we find that faithful expectation leads to humility. And soon we will see that faithful expectation also leads to boldness. Picking up in verse 24, it says, "And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I will be made well.'" So as Jesus and the crowd and Jairus begin their walk down this road, a new character enters the scene. This is a woman who has been suffering for 12 years. She is defiled. She is unclean. She is cast aside because of this disease that she has, because of this condition. And so these words, unclean, defiled, these have been her identifying marks for the past 12 years. And because of that, she has been cut off from public worship in the synagogue. She has no chance of marrying. And to make it all even worse, anyone that she merely touches, anyone that she comes in contact with will also be made unclean. And so she has lived a life of loneliness and embarrassment and hopelessness because she had spent all she had only to grow worse. But then she heard of this Jesus of Nazareth. Now this man reached out and touched a leper. And this touch didn't defile him. Instead, his touch cleansed the unclean man. She needed to see this Jesus. And so she searched for him. And finding him within the crowd, she began to push past the people. She was shoulder to shoulder with countless strangers, and yet she continued to move closer and closer, eyes fixed on Jesus. And with every step, she said to herself, "If I can just touch his garment, I will be made well. If I can just touch his garment, I will be made well." And then finally, in a great boldness, casting aside the fear of making anyone else around her unclean, she reached out with one bold, shaky hand, and she grabbed just the slightest grasp of Jesus' garment, trusting, expecting that she would be healed. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." You see, Jesus stops this whole procession to see who had touched him. And he's in the midst of a crowd, being pulled and tugged, and yet one touch of faith stood out above the rest. And this woman, knowing what she had done, knowing that she had taken a great risk in pushing her way through the crowd to touch Jesus' garment, she laid at his feet, when with arms stretched out on a dusty road, she testified in boldness. She testified to the truth of Jesus' healing power. And he looked at her and he said, "Daughter, go in peace. Go as one who has been restored to a right relationship with God." In her story, we see that faithful expectation leads to boldness. We continued to pray for my grandfather. We continued to pray for healing and restoration. And in the midst of that faithful expectation, he was given opportunities to be bold. He shared the gospel while getting blood transfusions, and he talked about his hope in Jesus on long elevator rides up through the hospital floors. He was given a renewed sense of boldness and a renewed desire to share his hope with anyone that he came in contact with. And for us, as we walk in expectation, as we walk hoping in the healing power of Jesus, we too ought to be bold. We ought to be so filled to the brim with truth and hope that it just flows out of us. And so, in Jairus' story, we see that faithful expectation leads to humility. In the bleeding woman's story, we see that faithful expectation leads to boldness. And finally, we will see that faithful expectation leads to healing. Continuing on in verse 35, It says, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Now, in this time and in this culture, it was pretty common for families to hire professional mourners who would come to their homes and who would mourn and grieve and comfort the families while they waited for funeral preparations to be made. So when Jesus comes onto the scene, he kind of takes it all in, and he sees, instrumentalists perhaps, or singers, or people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he sees this, he says, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but she is just sleeping." And they laughed at him. These professional mourners quickly turned into mockers, almost as if to say, "I don't know who this guy thinks he is, but we kind of do this thing for a living, and normally when a person's dead, they stay dead." You see, they saw death as the final barrier. There was no recovery from it. They didn't see what Jesus was truly saying, that although this girl is dead now, her death will be no more permanent than a sleep. And so seeing that they were insensitive, he sent them away. He put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. In this moment, Jesus reaches out with tenderness and compassion. He grabs this girl by the hand and restores her to life. Jesus has defeated death with an anthem that says, "Do not fear, only believe, for faith surpasses fear." And so in this story, we find two situations in desperate need of Jesus' intervention. We find a woman who has been suffering for 12 years, who has tried everything she could and is beyond help. And we have a little girl, just 12 years old, who is at the point of death and in need of rescuing. And we also see expectation. We see the expectation that Jesus, if he would just lay hands on the girl, she would be made well. And we see the expectation that if the bleeding woman could just touch Jesus' cloak, she would be made well again. And ultimately, we see an expectation of healing. Healing is beautiful. When a marriage is restored, when an illness is cured, when spring finally comes and all that was dry and dead bursts new life. And so we can anticipate healing, and we can rejoice in having that assurance. But this brings up an important question. What do we do when healing doesn't come? What do we do when it feels like, with all that's within you, you are reaching for just the slightest grasp of Jesus' cloak, and you get the test results back again, and it's bad news once again? What do you do when you fall on your face at the feet of Jesus, asking that he would restore a broken relationship? But over time, bitterness and resentment continually creep back in and just push you further and further apart. What do you do when healing doesn't come? My grandfather battled cancer for 5 months before he went to be with the Lord. Started off in his lungs, moved its way to his liver, and then to his bones. He became weak and tired, and eventually he couldn't speak anymore. And I know I gave a lot of examples of his incredible faith, but there were hard days. There were days where he looked into the eyes of his wife, whom he loved and adored, and he thought to himself, "Must we part so soon?" And then there were days where he cried with his daughter, remembering and realizing that he was going to miss some pretty important moments in his children's lives and in the lives of his grandchildren. But even on the hard days, he glorified God. Even on the hard days, he praised Jesus, expecting that he would be healed. But the healing he looked towards wasn't a momentary earthly healing. Instead, it was an eternal healing that had been promised to him from the very first moment that he believed. And we read about this in Revelation 21. It says, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away.' And he who was seated on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.' Also he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.'" My grandfather didn't get the healing that we had hoped and prayed for. As his life neared an end, the family gathered around and read through the Psalms together and sang worship songs. And before it came to the point where he could no longer speak, there were two phrases that came from his lips, day after day, hour after hour. He said, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Jesus." It was almost as if he saw Jesus in the midst of a crowd. And moving towards him, he began to push past the people. He's shoulder to shoulder with countless strangers, and yet he continues to move closer and closer. And with every step, he says to himself, "I'm almost home. I'm almost home." And then finally, the healing did come. The healing came. My friends, if you are in pain, healing is coming. If you are seeking restoration, healing is coming. If you are overwhelmed by the brokenness of this world, healing is coming. And it's hard to see that, and it's hard to hold on to that sometimes because we live on this side of the cross, and we catch little glimpses of it, but not yet in its fullness. But we can have assurance, and we can have confidence that Jesus Christ is making all things new, and we can have our eternal hope in that. And so we can be humble, and we can ask God that he would provide restoration to a broken world, and we can be bold and testify about his healing power, and ultimately we can be confident that healing is on its way. Do not fear, only believe, for faith surpasses fear.